Good morning, guys. Back out on the water. As you probably know already, the subject of this podcast is the relationship between Christianity and alchemy. As an introduction to this podcast, I've chosen a song which I think somewhat euphemistically sums up the entire philosophy of Hermetism and also the relationship between Christianity and alchemy. And I think that statement and the song you're about to hear might upset a few people, but let's dig into it after we've had a listen. That flowering bush there is Manuka, where the famous honey comes from. Okay, so let's talk about why I say that that song is the summation of the philosophy, the Hermetic philosophy. and of the relationship between Hermetism, alchemy and Christianity. Oh, that's good. So our story really begins back in ancient history and the roots of the Hermetic tradition. History again, and history is so important. We can say with relative confidence that the core of the Hermetic tradition was the belief in the concept that in the afterlife a dead person will either end up in a kind of hell or in a sort of paradise. In ancient Egypt, the hell was the lake of fire, and the paradise was what they called the field of reeds, or the papyrus fields. And to end up in paradise required a process known as becoming one with Osiris, Lord of the underworld, or King of the dead. At first, the magical rites, which were designed to cause a dead soul to avoid hell and to end up in the field of reeds, was reserved only for the kings. And then probably a little bit later, the king, the high priests, and the king's family. And these rites were highly secret and were enacted probably in secret ritual chambers that the average person knew nothing about. Not many people are aware, certainly not many Western occultists are aware, that the ancient Egyptians believed in a form of Eucharist, the drinking of the blood and the eating of the flesh of Osiris, or Seraphis, or one of the other resurrection gods. They also believed in a form of baptism, and of course they believed in the resurrection, in the afterlife. So none of these ideas are novel to Christianity, and they certainly were not new at all. They were already thousands of years old by the time Christianity came around. So one of the things that we know about alchemy is that tradition tells us that it began in Egypt. But the chances are that it was probably older than Egypt, but human memory really only goes back as far as Egypt. We don't really have any solid evidence, as far as I'm aware, that the Sumerians, for example, were aware of alchemy and practiced it, although there are things about the alchemical tradition that obviously appear in the Sumerian tradition, esoteric traditions, such as the concept of ingesting a substance in order to obtain immortality. We can see that concept represented in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where he sought for immortality and for a plant that would provide him with that immortality. So certainly concepts associated with the heart of alchemy were already old by the time the Egyptians got their hands on them. The next stage in our story is the Judaic tradition, the Semitic tradition actually, because there are a number of different Semitic tribes which were not Judaic, and they were involved in the same kinds of beliefs and practices. And we know that the Jews were held in captivity in Babylon, and Babylon was a culture that grew out of the Sumerian tradition, and they were very similar. And we also know that the Jews were held captivity in Egypt and were involved with the Egyptians. And so Moses, for example, was a member of the Egyptian royal family after he was found in the basket floating in the Nile. Another story which actually is older than Moses and goes back to the Sumerian tradition, where a similar individual was found floating in a river and was rescued and became a hero. So we know that the Jews learned and absorbed, were exposed to the esoteric traditions of Sumer, Chaldea, Babylon and Egypt. And even though they were a slave class, somehow they managed to get involved in the esoteric tradition of those nations and adopted a lot of their beliefs and practices. And what we know about the Judaic tradition esoterically is that they were heavily involved in alchemy. And if you go back into my earlier podcasts, you'll see where I discuss the concept of Genesis in the Old Testament and how they're based on the Opus Saturni as a philosophy for the story of creation. So many Western alchemists accepted this concept that the opening chapters of Genesis were actually a description of the acetate path. And so, however it happened back in the day, there was definitely a mix-up, a confusion, a interpolation between the acetate path philosophy and theory and the concepts of creation, the myth of creation, in those early Semitic cultures. And we can assume with good confidence, it's not absolute proof and nobody's done really serious research into it as far as I'm aware, but we could say that the Jews adopted these concepts from the Sumerians, Chaldeans, Babylonians and the Egyptians. So that in the Middle East, these ideas of the creation myth and an understanding of the theory and philosophy of alchemy were widespread. We could even go as far as saying it's a ground-bred tradition. And because of this, the Judaic esoteric tradition is tightly bound up with the alchemical tradition. Wherever we poke our nose around looking for information on alchemy in the past, we find Jews and the Judaic tradition intimately tied up. So, for example, the oldest known practicing alchemist that we have a literary record for is the woman who goes by the name of Mary the Prophetess, and she was a Jew, probably living somewhere around the big trout, somewhere around the 2nd century AD. That was a big trout. And so it's very hard to argue against the idea that Jews were closely bound up in the early alchemical tradition, and that they actually came to the game probably quite late, because the Sumerians, Chaldeans, Babylonians, Egyptians were already heavily involved in that whole scene. We don't have, as I said, much proof that the Sumerians, Chaldeans and Babylonians practiced alchemy, but we can assume that that is the case. So, one of the other important aspects of the Judaic tradition, which is Kabbalah, we also know that that wasn't original to the Jews either, even though most people in the Western tradition, Western esoteric tradition, talk about Kabbalah as if it was a Jewish invention and if it's wholly their possession. In fact, we often hear the term Hebrew Kabbalah or Judaic Kabbalah, when in actual fact they probably took that from the Sumerians and the Babylonians as well. So, if we can safely argue that the Jews were deeply involved in lab alchemy, like they knew its secrets and they were producing the elixir and the stone, and that knowledge was part of their esoteric tradition, then it's not a huge leap to also claim that it's very likely that Kabbalah and alchemy had a relationship as well. And I've attempted partially in some of the previous podcasts to point out how this is probably the case. That alchemy is about the physical world, the esoteric secrets of the physical world, and Kabbalah originally and essentially is about the secrets of the inner world or the psychological world. the physical and the non-physical, two philosophies and esoteric studies, practices that are bound together to encompass the secrets of the entire reality. So the important thing about Judaism, of course, is that Jesus was a Jew. Oh, big trout. They're coming up to the surface for the morning because the water's cool up here now. They need cool water. They usually go deep during the day when it's hot. It's right down there. So beautiful out here this morning. Yes, so Jesus was a Jew, of course. And since we know the Jews had a very heavy esoteric tradition, deeply evolved and developed alchemical tradition, and a deeply evolved inner tradition, inner work tradition. I think it would be highly unlikely, as some people claimed, as some people still claim, that Christ went to India or even Egypt to be trained as an initiate, because that would have been entirely unnecessary, because the Hebrew esoteric tradition at the time of Christ's life was deeply developed, and those guys could attain illumination and had a strong grasp of the magical tradition and the alchemical tradition when Christ was alive. So there would have been no need for him to go to India, for example, and possibly no need for him to go to Egypt, although the part of his childhood that's missing out of the Gospels, it's pretty much believed that his family spent that time with him in Egypt before he pops up again, I think at the wedding at Cana, where the beginning of his public journey started. And of course, because the Jews' esoteric tradition strongly originated in Egypt, it's probably not far-fetched to assume that he might have gone back there, traced his lineage back, followed his lineage back to Egypt in order to indulge in the esoteric tradition that was still surviving there, even after the destruction the Greeks and the Romans had caused in Egypt and ruining the esoteric tradition there. Anyway, the important thing is that Christ was a Jew, and therefore it's probably highly likely that he was deeply involved in the Hebrew esoteric tradition. Like, he wouldn't have just ignored it. You wouldn't ignore a working, viable, powerful esoteric teaching in your own culture and preference for the teaching in a country which was thousands of miles away. That's my argument. So the whole mythos that has grown up around Christ and the importance of the role he is said to have played in the emancipation of humanity, or at least in the emancipation of individuals, is tied up in the Hebrew esoteric tradition, in my humble opinion. And I think a lot of other people would probably agree with that. So we can say that Christ was very likely a highly educated Kabbalist. He was considered a rabbi, and studying Kabbalah was a rabbinic tradition. And it's quite possible also, because he was considered to be such an important initiate, at least by some Jews, that he had also been initiated into the secrets of alchemy. And one of the arguments that I give for that claim that Christ had been initiated, at least into the theory of alchemy, is based on this very simple concept. Something that there's not a lot of evidence for. The argument is thin on the ground, but anybody who's been involved in these things will understand what I'm saying and will, at the least, I feel, agree with the concept or the theory. And that is that if we read, for example, the book of Revelation, St. John's book of the Revelation, or in Greek, the Apocalypse, which means the revealing or the unveiling or the unfolding, we can see John talking about doing inner work. And again, I'm not talking here to people with no esoteric training and expecting them to believe and accept what I'm saying. I'm talking here to other initiates, or at least on behalf of other initiates who know, when they read the book of Revelation, that John is describing inner work experiences. He goes into like a dream state and has visions, and in these visions there's a lot of information about the end times, or the time when the apocalypse or the great revelation takes place. And one of the curious things about, first of all, one of the things we know about St. John is that he was involved in the same tradition as Christ. Whatever Christ had been taught, whatever esoteric knowledge he knew about, John would have been moving in those same circles. And that means John would have been a Kabbalist, and he would probably have known about the secrets of alchemy as well. Now, one of the things about the inner work, one of the things that we know from extensive practice and research, is that when you study a particular symbol system, such as Kabbalah and or alchemy, your unconscious mind, whose native language is symbolism, starts to adopt and speak to you in the language of the esoteric systems that you're studying. So in other words, in your inner work practices and in your dreams, especially your vivid or lucid dreams, you find increasingly, when you study Kabbalah properly and study alchemy properly, that your mind becomes absolutely saturated with the symbols of Kabbalah and alchemy, and they start appearing in your dreams. Your unconscious mind recognizes that the symbols of these two systems are a valid way of it using its own language system, the system of symbolism, to describe the nature of the inner reality and its relationship to the outer reality. And it starts adopting the symbols of alchemy and Kabbalah and feeding them back to you, because it knows that you have a reference frame for these symbols. Often the symbols that our unconscious mind natively uses before we study esoteric subjects, it's hard for us to decipher those symbols because we have no context or reference frame. The unconscious seems to be aware of this and is built in such a way that it, a couple of native hawks there, the unconscious mind is built in such a way that it will adopt other symbol systems and talk back to you in those systems. So when we read records or reports from people who are practicing inner work and they're properly trained, they're doing the process technically properly in order to minimize any corruption or faults in the experience and in the information that they get back. In other words, they're trained inner work initiates. Whenever we read recorded reports by such people, we can tell what kind of esoteric system they've been studying simply by the description of their inner work environment and experience. And one of the curious things about St. John and the apocalypse and the visions that he had there is that a lot of his visions describe the apocalypse and related subjects discussing metals and minerals. And from that, we could assume, there's no hard evidence and there's no serious research really being done on this, we can assume that these metallic and mineral gemstone jewel iconography and symbols in his visions may be there because of the influence that the alchemical tradition had in his initiatory training. So now we've gone from the Judaic tradition being involved in alchemy, and we know that for a fact, there's historic record of it, to the idea that this esoteric tradition look at that, that's just gorgeous this morning. From the Judaic tradition to the idea that Christ, the people who he was mingling with, and the students that he was teaching had adopted, at least partially, if they weren't studying other traditions as well, the Hebrew esoteric tradition that involved Kabbalah and alchemy. Certainly St. John's visions in the book of Revelation give us very good reason to assume that he was both a Kabbalist and a student of alchemy, the alchemy of his era, of course, not the alchemy of our era. So if Christ and his students were involved in the study of Kabbalah and alchemy, then it goes to follow without too much difficulty that the parts of Christ's life and ministry which are more legend and mythology than real life, because we know the Old Testament and the New Testament are a mixture of history and allegory, symbolism, mythology. It's not all hard history. And it's not all hard symbology, because we know that there are historic facts in the Old and the New Testaments. So the mythology that Christ and his disciples wove into the stories about Christ's life and his ministry, the mythology that was woven into those stories, we can pretty much bet that the people who were writing and designing, because mythology has to be designed, has to be created, it's a work of art by people who were Kabbalists and alchemists. And so when we take the high points of Christ's life and look at the key events and consider that the people who wrote those down, who were recording them for posterity, or who were recording them as a kind of teaching system, esoteric teaching system, when we're looking at those high points of Christ's life, it's not too hard when we start poking around to find alchemical references. And we've got to remember, when I say alchemical references, that we're not talking about alchemy like we would look at it today. We're talking about the alchemical tradition as it would have existed 2,000 years ago. So, for example, the very first thing that appears in the New Testament at the beginning of Christ's ministry is his turning water into wine at the wedding at Cana. My memory and understanding of Christian teaching and mythology is rusty at best, even though I was brought up in a Christian family. I don't really pay a lot of attention to these things, and over the years I've shown an obvious interest, because you never know what kind of secrets you'll find lodged in Judaic and Christian esoteric tradition. But I think the wedding at Cana was the first time that Christ did something where it became publicly known that he was like an adept, an initiate. Turning water into wine is a very interesting, or could be construed as being a very interesting alchemical allegory, especially if we think about what we really know about the facts about the acetate path tradition. Especially also since it happened at a wedding. And we all know, anybody who pays attention to alchemy and the Western tradition, Western Hermetic tradition, we all know that the concept of a wedding plays a deeply important part in alchemical allegory. There are also other things in the story of Christ's life and his ministry which could be construed as being very obvious references to laboratory alchemy as well, such as the fact that when he was crucified, and we all know that the idea of crucifixion and the word crucius have very alchemical meanings, or have potent meanings in the Western alchemical tradition. Part of the number of important things that happened when Christ was crucified is that he was fed vinegar, and that he was stabbed with a spear and blood flowed out of him. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist if you know something about the acetate path tradition to realise that, to understand that, to be aware that vinegar or acetic acid plays an important role in the acetate path. And it's not unusual to hear or see written by alchemists of the classic period, medieval alchemy primarily, we give our stone, we feed our stone vinegar. Sometimes they call it the vinegar of the sages or the vinegar of the wise. Without having done any research on this subject, because I couldn't really bring myself to it, got a lot to do, there's a couple of small things that we can consider to defend the argument that there are alchemical references in the Gospels, and some of those alchemical references are directly related to Christ's life. That parts of his personal journey seem to have chunks of alchemical allegory inserted into them. And we would assume that this has been done because the people who wrote those allegories as a form of encoding information and as a form of secret teaching, we can assume that they wanted us to see Christ's life as being an allegory or symbolic of the journey of the philosopher's stone from its crude matter to the point where it becomes a powerful esoteric remedy. A lot of you will also be aware that the idea that Christ himself represents the philosopher's stone or is the philosopher's stone is also quite a common concept in the Western esoteric tradition. And it's talked about a lot, particularly in the Western mystical tradition, where they talk a lot about Christ being the internal philosopher's stone, and that to become like Christ or have communion with Christ is the same as making the physical philosopher's stone, that it transmutes us from within. And certainly in Hermetism, we know from experience that these concepts are not simply playing around with words or making up fancy esoteric allegories simply to piece together a fairy tale story or tradition. That these concepts are real. That in the past, in the Kabbalistic tradition, for example, there is an inner work process which focuses on the idea of an internal Christ-like being, which in Hermetism we refer to as the higher genius. We don't have to make a huge leap in logic to understand that the higher genius in the modern Western esoteric tradition and inheritance teaching is basically the same concept as an internal Christ figure. That uniting with this being in the right way causes a resurrection of the soul in the afterlife and to attain immortality, the attainment of immortality. And that this is the summit of the Hermetic tradition. All of the fancy bells and whistles and tinsel in the Hermetic tradition, at the end of the day, when we strip it off all the fancy stuff and just look at what essentially is the core philosophy and story of Hermetism, that core philosophy and story is all about how an individual carries out certain esoteric practices in order to ensure in the afterlife that he or she does not go into the gross regions of the afterlife and be trapped there and forced back into reincarnation, but instead attains to a resurrected state, in other words, a perfected condition of the soul, where immortality resides, where the soul lives forever in the reed beds of ancient Egypt, or the Elysian fields of the Greeks, or the paradise of the Christians. Now let's go back to the song that I put in the introduction to this podcast. It's a bit amusing, interesting song, a fun cover of the original, but it sums up the entire philosophy and concepts of the Western Hermetic tradition and even the ancient Hermetic tradition. Because basically what that song is saying is, if I get good with Jesus, in other words, if I align my life properly through the right processes in order to form a strong, lasting, productive relationship with my higher genius, then that situation is a free ticket to uniting with the divine, or taking part in the life of immortality in paradise. And that's basically what that song is telling us, weirdly enough. The dude who wrote that, I'm sure he didn't quite think of it like that, but he was trying to distill down, to use a bit of a pun, the key concepts of Christian philosophy, and didn't realize that he was also espousing the key concepts of the Hermetic philosophy. And a really important part of that journey of being involved in the right practices in the right way, not just mucking about trying to do it yourself and slapping things together in the hope that it will all work out in the end, but doing it properly in the right way, being a trained initiate. One of the other key factors in that situation is what the ancient Egyptians called the Hall of Judgment. And in the Christian tradition, because Christianity adopted the same concept, that's the final judgment, where your soul is weighed. And as long as you haven't sinned, or as the ancient Egyptians said, you didn't do bad things, and what was it, the 42 or the 72 assessors that looked at your soul as it was being weighed in front of Thoth in the Hall of Judgment to decide whether you were a bad person or a good person. And a similar thing happening in the Christian tradition. Do not sin so that Christ will accept you and then you will live for eternity, be resurrected, and at the end of days, the final judgment, you will go to paradise, blah 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 blah. These are the same teachings developed thousands of years apart, so they sound a little bit different, but in essence they are the same thing. And the process of initiation, one of the things that it does is, one of the key things that it does is that it repairs the damage done to your soul, if you like, for want of a better word. In modern terms you could say your psyche. The process of initiation repairs the damage that is done to your psyche while you are alive, while you're going through the cycle of reincarnation. Because every life that you live, you can't help it, you end up doing things that are toxic to you, are toxic to your soul. And every time you die, that toxic stuff affects whether or not you are going to stay in the cycle of reincarnation, or whether or not you are now clean and pure and balanced enough to enter the reed beds, the paradise of the Christians. Normally, that judgment, that weighing of the soul to decide what your future is going to be, what the future of your soul is, immediate future of your soul is going to be, happens in the afterlife. We hear about that quite a bit, where people review the events of the incarnation which they've just finished, and that review also involves them looking at the things that they have done with clear eyes, and judging their own behaviour in life. And then the summation of that review of your life and that self-judgment is weighed up and becomes the directing compass of your soul as to whether or not you're going to continue reincarnation. Now, for most people, that happens immediately after death, in the afterlife. But one of the things that the ancient adepts learned was that you can actually carry out that process while you are alive. You can review the journey of your life, recognize the things that are powerful, helpful, righteous, and the things that are poisonous, and make the necessary adjustments in your psyche in order to bring about balance in yourself again. And we know for a fact, from copious experience with hundreds of students and from the references in the old tradition that talk about this whole subject, that as soon as you manage to get that soul purification carried out properly, automatically you are ushered into the presence of your higher genius, or if you're a Christian or interested in Christian mythology, you're ushered into the presence of Christ, you're reborn, and you live immortally in the higher realms, what Kabbalah calls the archetypal world, paradise. This is what initiation is all about. If I, as the song says at the beginning of this podcast, if I get right with Jesus, he will recommend me to the spirit in the sky. If I align myself with my higher genius, and the higher genius is pure, balanced, and deeply wise, if I become pure, balanced and deeply wise also, then I have formed a strong relationship and a strong bond with my higher genius. And what that means is that when I find myself in the afterlife, my higher genius will recommend me to the spirit in the sky. In other words, I will be automatically ushered into the divine realm. The divine realm. That's what initiation is all about. Everything we do in Hermetism, all the study, all of the esoteric psychology and therapy is all designed to cleanse the soul in order to form a strong bond with the higher genius or Christ, in order that in the afterlife we attain a pure, balanced and immortal condition. Contrary to popular belief, initiation is not about attaining things in the physical life or affecting the mundane world so that we have a better physical life. This is not about having a better physical life. That's a childish thing. It's like wanting lollies at the supermarket all the time, sweets or candy as the Americans would say. The initiate foregoes the desire for earthly pleasure in order to assure himself or herself peace and harmony in the afterlife. That's what we're doing. We're preparing now, investing now in the afterlife. And we do that because once you're in the afterlife, you can't change what you are. When you're in the afterlife, you remain what you have become in physical reality. The Kabbalists call Malkut, the lowest sphere on the tree of life, which represents the physical universe. They call it the world of action. And they call Malkut the world of action because in incarnation, that's the only place where you can do things that make a difference. In the higher realms, nothing can be changed. Everything stays the way it has developed from action in the physical world. So that is pretty much my story in as basic a format as possible, so it doesn't get too complicated. For those of you who ask me, please, yes, do a podcast on the relationship between Christianity and alchemy. A couple of final closing comments. The first one is, remember that it's very likely that Christ and his apostles and his disciples studied Kabbalah and alchemy. It's very likely, and there's traces of that in the Bible for those with eyes to see. Part of those biblical references involve quite possibly an attempt in the past or an actual successful construction of the story of Christ's life to make it an alchemical allegory. We know that biblical account has been seriously damaged, that several bad players, including the church, have removed books from the Bible, from the Gospels, and have edited things and corrupted things. Some of this has been intentional and some of it has been out of ignorance or misunderstanding, and so a lot of damage has occurred to the story of Christ's life. It's quite possible that originally the alchemical allegory of Christ's life was more obvious, and the original text. We don't really know. All we know is that there definitely is esoteric knowledge in the Bible and in the Gospels. There's direct references that any serious initiate would recognize to esoteric teaching, to esoteric school, to an esoteric stream in the New Testament. These old records, the New Testament, the Old Testament, are seriously damaged. A lot of the people who have preserved and carried on the biblical tradition are not initiates, so they don't recognize esoteric knowledge when it's right in front of their face, because they're not part of the tradition. They were not trained to understand the esoteric knowledge that was put in the Bible. And this is one of the reasons why the old adepts about the esoteric writings, and you can hear alchemists say the same thing, is do not change one word in what I have written. They say that because they know if you start mucking about with a text thinking that you're doing good things or being helpful, if you're not properly trained, you could twist understandings or remove them without being aware of doing so. Of course, some people deliberately removed esoteric knowledge from the Bible, and some of it was done accidentally or out of ignorance. So all that remains today are scant traces of an old tradition, which I believe is heavily Christian, alchemical and Kabbalistic, and that the Rosicrucians of the 17th century knew this. And if we study very carefully the Rosicrucian tradition, we find out that the two most important things that they were involved in and that they taught and spoke about were Christianity and alchemy. If nothing else, when we are beginning to investigate these concepts, if nothing else, a close examination of the Rosicrucian tradition will help to convince us that those people who were very clever people in Europe in the 17th century, and they were aware of a secret tradition that married Christianity and alchemy. And a lot of their teachings and beliefs have been adopted by other adepts in the alchemical tradition, and we see these concepts sprinkled everywhere amongst alchemical literature, older alchemical literature from the classic period.